EAA's webinars are made possible through the generous support of Aircraft Spruce and Specialty, serving homebuilders and EAA members since 1965. Tonight's presentation is Major or Minor, and our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. He's an author for numerous aviation publications. Mike holds a certified flight instructor certificate, an A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization privileges. In 2008, he was FAA's Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year and a member of the EAA. Mike, we're so lucky that you volunteer your time each month to come to us and give us this information. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Good evening, Tim. Good evening, everybody. As I mentioned to Tim earlier, I'm operating under battlefield conditions here. I'm not at home in my usual setting here, so I'm using something of a jury-rigged setup, but I think we should be okay now. At any rate, it looks like we have a little over 300 people in the room, and thanks everybody for showing up. As Tim said, tonight's presentation is entitled Alterations, Major or Minor. We're going to be talking about the rules for making alterations to certificated aircraft. And just to illustrate some of the issues that we're going to be talking about, I'll tell you a couple of stories where things like this came up. A Bonanza owner asked his avionics shop to install a second cigarette lighter socket on the panel of his Bonanza to accommodate his iPad charger and portable GPS. The avionics shop explained to the Bonanza owner that this would require an FAA field approval from the FSDO and that getting one would probably be costly and time consuming. We'll talk a little bit about field approvals and exactly how one goes about getting one. In any case, the avionics shop discouraged a Bonanza owner from doing this. Later on, the owner made the exact same request of his regular A&P mechanic, and the mechanic said no problem, installed the second socket in the Bonanza, signed it off with a simple logbook entry. So the question is, who was right? The avionics shop that said you can't do this without a field approval, or the A&P mechanic who installed it and signed it off with a simple logbook entry? Along a similar vein, a Cessna 210 owner had his mechanic install a landing gear mirror on the underside of the left wing so that he could look out and verify that the landing gear was down and locked. All that was all fine. The mechanic went ahead and did that. And then several years later, at an annual inspection, the IA who was inspecting the aircraft said that he could not find a Form 337 for this mirror and insisted that he couldn't sign off the annual as airworthy unless the owner consented to remove the mirror or else go to obtain an FAA field approval to approve its installation. So again, the question is, who was right? Was the A&P who installed the mirror to begin with correct in doing that, or was the IA who insisted that it had to come off correct? This whole area of alterations and which ones are legal, which ones require FAA permission, and so on, is quite confusing. And it's not only confusing to owners, but it's quite confusing to mechanics, as these two stories indicate, where you have different maintenance professionals rendering diametrically opposite opinions as to whether an alteration is permissible, whether it requires a field approval, and so on. So that's what we want to talk about tonight, is what the rules are about alterations and what the procedures are. Anytime you modify a certificated aircraft, you've committed what's known as an alteration. And the FAA recognizes two different kinds of alterations. They call them major alterations and minor alterations. as you probably can figure out from the terminology, the FAA is very interested in major alterations, and they have a whole bunch of requirements before a major alteration is permitted. Minor alterations are the ones that the FAA doesn't really want to know about. They consider them sufficiently inconsequential that they don't want to even be bothered with it. So the question is, how do you decide whether an alteration is major or minor? And who decides? And what is the guidance for making that decision? Well, the first place you would normally go is FAR 1.1, which is the part of the FARs where terms are defined. And sure enough, in FAR 1.1, there's a definition of the term major alteration. And it says that a major alteration is one that might appreciably affect weight limits, CG limits, structural strength, performance, power plant operation, flight characteristics, or other qualities affecting airworthiness. It also says that any alteration that is not done using accepted practices is a major alteration, and any alteration that can't be done using elementary operations is a major alteration. Now, that definition leaves an awful lot to the imagination. First of all, what does appreciably mean? What other qualities affecting airworthiness are they talking about? What are accepted practices and what are elementary operations? None of those things are defined in the regs. So as I said, this definition leaves a lot to the imagination. And so in order to provide some additional guidance in making a decision as to whether an alteration is major or minor, the FAA, in addition to this basic FAR 1.1 definition, provides further guidance. The primary source of that guidance is Appendix A of Part 43. And in Appendix A of Part 43, the FAA lists a whole bunch of things that they consider to be major alterations. So a mechanic can go look at that list in Part 43, Appendix A, and see whether the alteration that is being proposed is in that list or is similar to something in that list, in which case it's reasonable for him to assume that it's a major alteration. On the other hand, if the alteration is not in the list of things spelled out in Part 43, and if it doesn't clearly seem to trigger any of the major criteria in the FAR 1.1 definition, then it's reasonable for the mechanic to conclude that the alteration is a minor alteration. In addition to Part 43, Appendix A, there are a number of advisory circulars that give information about certain things. The FAA has an advisory circular, for example, that says that the installation of shoulder harnesses is a minor alteration, that the installation of angle of attack indicators is a minor alteration. These are things that the FAA wants to encourage people to do. And so one of the ways that they encourage people to install these things is to say, we're not going to put you through any rigmarole. You can just go ahead and install them. There's an advisory circular that basically says installation of ADS-B out in an aircraft where the ADS-B out system was not specifically approved for that particular make and model, but has been approved for some other make and model, is considered to be a minor alteration under certain circumstances. Again, something that the FAA is trying to encourage people to do. So there is a fair amount of guidance that one can look at in trying to determine whether an alteration is major or minor. And the next question is, who gets to decide? How do you who makes the decision as to whether an alteration is treated as major or minor. And what the regulations say is that the responsibility for determining whether an alteration is major or minor lies with the mechanic who performs the alteration. So the mechanic is not supposed to go to the FSDO and say, do I need your permission to do this? It's the mechanic's job to read the regulations and the other guidance that the FAA provides in writing and make a determination as to whether the alteration is major or minor. And a mechanic who just goes to the FSDO automatically is not doing his job and is probably not doing you any favors. Now, if a mechanic determines that the alteration is a minor one, that he may perform it using acceptable data. I'll talk about what acceptable data means in a minute. And he may sign it off with a simple logbook entry. A minor alteration does not require going to the FAA. It does not require filling out a Form 337. The FAA never gets informed that the minor alteration has been done. And it doesn't want to be informed. The fact that the alteration is minor means that it's one the FAA is just not interested in knowing about. What's acceptable data? Well, acceptable data, first of all, when they talk about data in this context, it means drawings, specifications, methods, techniques, and practices. And for them to be acceptable, they simply have to meet all the requirements of all applicable FARs. The acceptable data does not need to be reviewed or accepted by the FAA prior to use. The mechanic who uses acceptable data should theoretically be prepared to demonstrate to the FAA why he believes it meets all applicable requirements if he was challenged. But normally he never is challenged. Normally it's never questioned. And the FAA would have the burden of proof that what the mechanic did not meet regulations. In other words, things are presumed to be acceptable unless the FAA can show a specific regulatory violation why it's not acceptable. So simply saying that a minor alteration is done in accordance with acceptable data is very broad. It means that if the mechanic uses any reasonable method of performing the alteration, it's okay. So again, for minor alterations, the FAA doesn't get involved, the FAA doesn't get informed, and the FAA basically trusts mechanics to do the right thing. Now, on the other hand, if the mechanic determines that the alteration is a major alteration, then it gets a lot more complicated. The mechanic is then required to perform it using approved data, not just acceptable data, but approved data. He must have an IA inspected. So if the installing mechanic is not an IA himself, he's going to have to call in an IA to inspect the alteration once it's made. And then the FAA has to be informed of the major alteration by filling out and submitting an FAA Form 337, which gets sent to Oklahoma City and becomes a permanent part of the aircraft's records down there. Now, approved data means drawing specifications, methods, techniques, and practices approved by some authorized representative of the FAA. So it unlike acceptable data, which the FAA doesn't ever have to have even seen, approved data must have been reviewed and signed off with the signature of an FAA employee typically, or in some cases, an FAA designee, like a designated engineering representative. But it has to have been actively approved by the FAA, not just acceptable. It's a much more stringent standard. Where do you get approved data? The most common source of approved data is a supplemental type certificate, an STC. Another possible source is an airworthiness directive. If an airworthiness directive requires that some alteration be made to an aircraft, then that airworthiness directive itself constitutes the approved data for making that alteration. An AD is basically an alteration that is being compelled by the FAA. If you want to perform a major alteration for which no STC or AD exists, then your mechanic is going to have to create the data himself and get some authorized representative of the FAA to approve it. Typically, that's done by an inspector at the local FSDO, and is called a field approval. So that's what a field approval is. It's when you go to the FSDO with unapproved data and ask an inspector at the FSDO to sign his name to it and make it into approved data so that you can do a major alteration. Field approvals, as you might guess, involve a whole bunch of paperwork. So let me talk a little bit about how you would actually go about getting a field approval. The first step is to figure out whether the FSDO is even authorized to grant a field approval for the alteration that you want to make. And the way you do that is you consult something, a 90-page document that you can find online called the Major Repair and Alteration Data Approval Online Job Aid. As I said, this is a 90-page document that was really written for FSDO inspectors. And it's the document that the FSDO inspector is going to use to determine whether he can grant a field approval. So before you even go to the FSDO, you want to pull up this 90-page job aid and go through it and find out whether or not the alteration you have in mind is one that the FSDO actually is empowered to approve. You can find this thing online. Just Google the phrase major alteration job aid and it'll take you right to it. Your A&P might not know about this online job aid unless he does a lot of field approvals. Because this, as I said, is a document that was really designed for FSDO inspectors. But since you really don't want to go through a whole bunch of work putting together a data package only to have it rejected out of hand, the smart thing to do is to go through this online job aid, the same thing that the FSDO inspector is going to have to go through, and figure out what it says as to whether your proposed alteration is one that the FSDO can grant a field approval for. And when you look in this job aid, a large part of it, page after page after page, lists all kinds of different alterations. And for each one, it codes the thing with a 3-letter identifier, ENG, STC, or EVL. What did I just do? I just hit something bad. Just a minute. Oh, sorry. If it says EVL, then you're in luck. What that means, EVL means that the FSDO inspector may evaluate that alteration for field approval. And so that would be good news. It means that the inspector is authorized to grant a field approval for that kind of alteration. If it says ENG, it means that the alteration would need an engineering evaluation, either by the aircraft certification office or by a designated engineering representative who you hire to do the engineering evaluation. FSDO inspectors are not aeronautical engineers, and so they can't do engineering evaluations. So if the job aid says that a particular kind of alteration requires an engineering evaluation, then you're probably going to have to hire a DER to do that before you can even apply for a field approval. And that can get fairly expensive because DERs don't come cheap. And finally, if the kind of alteration that you're looking at is coded as STC in the job aid, it means field approvals are not allowed. And the only way that this alteration could be approved would be to apply for a full-blown STC, which is a big, elaborate deal. So first you consult the job aid, and hopefully it will say that the kind of alteration that you're interested in doing is one that is coded EVL, and that indeed the FSDO inspector is authorized to evaluate for a field approval. The next step would be to fill out a Form 337 and attach the data packet, the data that you want the FAA to approve. The FAA is pretty strict about the format which that data needs to take, and the place you find out about that is an advisory circular called AC 43210A, which lists 16 specific items that need to be included in your data packet. Again, unless your A&P does a lot of field approvals, he may not know about this advisory circular, so you might have to point it out to him. But if you submit a request for field approval and you don't format your data into this 16-point format, the FAA is likely to kick it back. The 16 points, this is basically the 16 items that how they want the data to be structured. Frequently, many of these 16 points are not applicable to your particular alteration, in which case you say, special procedures not applicable or whatever it is. But they want you to structure the data in this 16-point format. And that advisory circular also has a nice field approval checklist that you can go through and make sure that all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed before you submit the Form 337 and data packet to the FSDO. Going through all of this greatly increases the chance that you'll get your field approval the first time. Then finally, when you're all ready, you submit your 337 and your 16-point data package and the field approval checklist to the local FSDO. And your submission will then be assigned to a particular aviation safety inspector at the FSDO for evaluation and hopefully for approval. If the A&P you're working with is an IA, he will already have a relationship with a principal maintenance inspector at the FSDO, which can be helpful because it's always helpful if your mechanic has a good working relationship with an inspector at the FSDO. And every IA has a principal maintenance inspector who he works with at the FSDO. So working with an IA on this is quite helpful. In any case, the aviation safety inspector will evaluate the stuff that you submit in accordance with the instructions in the job aid. He first has to determine whether indeed what you're proposing to do is a major alteration. If he finds it's a minor alteration, he'll kick your application back and say, this is a minor alteration, you don't need a field approval. Second, he'll make sure that he is authorized to approve a field approval for that kind of thing. That's what that coding in the job aid will tell him. And finally, we'll go through and verify that the alteration you're proposing complies with all applicable airworthiness standards. Again, keep in mind that aviation safety inspectors are not aeronautical engineers, so that if the inspector determines that your alteration requires an engineering evaluation, he's going to tell you that you're going to have to hire a DER. or else go to the FAA Aircraft Certification Office. Going to a DER usually costs quite a bit of money. Going to the Aircraft Certification Office usually takes a long time because you wind up at the end of the line. So in either case, if what you're proposing requires an engineering evaluation, it may not be worth the effort to try to get it approved. In any case, if the package that you submit passes muster, then the safety inspector will return your Form 337 with block number 3 stamped and signed, which is what constitutes the field approval, and it basically says this data that you submitted is now FAA approved. At which point you can go ahead and make the alteration with impunity. If it doesn't pass muster, the ASI will return the package unsigned, explain the reason why he couldn't approve it, and give you an opportunity to fix whatever's wrong with it and resubmit it. Now, if this seems like a lot of work, it is. So it's best to avoid having to get field approvals because it's very cumbersome. And it's a lot harder to get field approvals nowadays than it used to be because the FAA has tightened up quite a lot on field approvals. So the best way to avoid all this hassle is to find an A&P mechanic who is comfortable treating your modification as a minor alteration, one that the mechanic can sign off with his own signature in a simple logbook entry, and that doesn't have to be brought to the attention of the FAA and get approval and go through all this paperwork that we've been talking about. So with that said, let's go back to where we started and talk a little bit about the 2 cases that I mentioned at the very beginning. Here's the Bonanza owner who wanted a second cigarette lighter socket installed in his Bonanza. Is this a major or a minor alteration? The avionics shop indicated that it was a major alteration that would require field approval. The Bonanza's regular A&P said it was a minor alteration and was willing to install it and sign it off with a simple logbook entry. Who was right? Well, in my opinion, the A&P was right. This is clearly not something that rises to the level of a major alteration. If you look in Part 43, Appendix A, at alterations to the electrical system, what Part 43, Appendix A says is that an alteration to the basic design of the electrical system, it constitutes a major alteration. So my reading of that is, if you were replacing a generator with an alternator, or you were putting in a dual battery system instead of a single battery system, or you were splitting the bus into separate buses for avionics and non-avionics, those would all constitute a change to the basic design of the electrical system, and those would be major alterations. But to simply add another circuit breaker to the system and hang some new electrical load on it, that's not a major alteration by any stretch of the imagination. That's a minor alteration. It's absolutely something that a mechanic can do with a simple logbook entry. And why the avionics shop indicated to the Bonanza owner that they felt they couldn't do it without a field approval, I don't understand. Now, again, according to the rules, it is the installing mechanic who makes the decision as to whether an alteration is major or minor. In effect, the mechanic is making a decision as to whether he feels this alteration is within his pay grade to sign off on his own recognizance, or whether it's above his pay grade and he needs the FAA to sign off on it. Each mechanic is entitled to make that decision independently. Certainly, if you came to me and asked me about this particular thing about installing a second cigarette lighter socket, I would say, well, that's obviously a minor alteration, and it's something that you could simply do and sign off with a simple logbook entry. But different mechanics are entitled to different opinions. That's why, in a case like this, it's a good idea to, if somebody tells you it's a major alteration and they can't do it without a field approval, go ask somebody else. All you need to do is find some mechanic who's comfortable with it. And of course, that's what this bonanza owner wound up doing. He didn't like the answer he got from the radio shop, so he asked his A&P. The A&P was comfortable doing it, went ahead and did it, no problem. The bonanza owner did exactly the right thing. Let's consider the there we go. Let's consider the case of the gear mirror on the 210. Well, that one's a little bit fuzzier. The gear mirror on the 210 would constitute a major alteration if it affected the aerodynamics of the aircraft. Now, I think that's quite a stretch to say that gear mirror would have a significant aerodynamic effect. I mean, the FAA seems to be cool with people velcroing GoPro cameras to their vertical stabilizers and stuff, and it seems to me that, in my judgment, the aerodynamic effect of adding that gear mirror would be negligible, but one could at least make an argument that maybe it has some aerodynamic effect, and if it did change the performance of the aircraft in an appreciable way. Appreciable basically means noticeable or measurable. Then it would constitute a major alteration. Personally, I think the mechanic who installed the gear mirror did so reasonably in good faith. I would tend to treat it as a minor alteration. I think the IA who insisted that it come back off again had his butt muscles clenched a little bit too tight for my taste. But again, every mechanic gets to make that decision independently. And frankly, if it were me, I would make the IA happy by taking the gear mirror off. And then as soon as the annual was signed off, I'd maybe go back to the mechanic who put it on and say, would you put it back on for me? And just say that, that IA is just was a little bit overly fussy. But at any rate, those are the basic rules involved in major or minor alterations. And to the extent that we can treat alterations as minor and find somebody who's comfortable, find a mechanic who's comfortable with doing that, it can save an awful lot of paperwork and an awful lot of grief. So that's basically all I have on this subject. Tim, why don't we open it up for some Q&A?
Okay, Mike, thanks. We got a couple questions in here. Harold's got one here. Replacing position lights with LED bulbs, major or minor, what is required?
First of all, I believe that most of the LED position lights that one can buy, say from Whalen and so on, are STC'd, which means that they come with approved data, and so you can install them as a major alteration, file a 337, and not have to deal with the field approval because the STC means that the data is already approved. If if you were to install LED position lights that are not STC'd, then it would be the burden of the installing mechanic to determine that those lights met the applicable FARs. And for position lights, there are quite specific FARs that talk about, what the coverage of those lights need to be and what the color of those lights need to be and so on. And I think it would be perfectly permissible for a mechanic to install them as a minor alteration if he could reasonably defend verify that indeed those LED lights met the regulatory requirements for position lights. I don't think that would necessarily be a major alteration, but most of the replacement position lights that you can buy are STC'd, so the problem's already solved for you, and you wouldn't need to get a field approval anyway.
Phil's wondering, would it be a good idea to call things a minor alteration in the aircraft records when you do the sign-off?
I think it actually would be. It's not something I see very much, but I think it would not hurt for the mechanic who makes that alteration to make a statement in the logbook entry saying that I have verified that this is a minor alteration that meets all applicable certification regulations, and describe what he did and sign it off, just to make it clear that he thought about it, and he thought about the question of whether it was major or minor, and made a determination that it was minor. Obviously, if he does the installation and signs it off with the logbook entry, he's implicitly stating that he considered it to be a minor alteration. But I do think it would be better to explicitly state that in the logbook entry. It's not a requirement, but I think it would be a good idea.
Okay, Valerie's wondering, your second example is somewhat concerning. If I do find a mechanic that will call my alteration minor, am I risking that every new inspector after that could demand that I get a field approval?
Well, obviously the inspector can't demand that you get a field approval. He can say, I can't sign off your annual unless you remove that thing. In the case of the gear mirror, the gear mirror is simply riveted to an inspection plate on the underside of the wing. So removing the gear mirror and replacing it with a blank inspection plate, takes all of 5 minutes, and it's no big deal. If it were an alteration that was very difficult to remove, then it might create more cause for concern. But in this case, the downside was very minor. The IA was basically saying, I'm not comfortable signing off the annual with that gear mirror, because for some reason the IA felt that it was a major alteration, even though the installing mechanic felt that it was a minor alteration. So, do you go get a field approval for the mirror? I don't think so. I think that'd be ridiculous. The path of least resistance for the aircraft owner is to say, okay, take the gear mirror off, get the annual signed off, and then decide whether he wants to put the gear mirror back on. And if he wants to put the gear mirror back on, find a mechanic or go to the original mechanic who put it on and have him put it back on, and just say, well, I'm not going to use that IA again. There was very little downside in that case. On the other hand, if somebody, put a leading edge cuff on the wing or something and called it a minor alteration, which would clearly be improper because that's a significant aerodynamic change to the aircraft. and then somebody said, I can't sign it off unless you remove the cuff. That's a big deal because, you got 500 rivets to drill out. But the gear mirror, there really wasn't any downside, so I don't see a big problem with it.
Okay, Drew's asking, with regards to the extra cigarette lighter in the Bonanza, does acceptable data require a TSO'd or PMA device be installed as opposed to a 12-volt socket purchased from an auto parts store?
Absolutely not. There's no requirement for it to be TSO'd. There are only a few things that are required to be TSO'd. Altimeters, for example, have to meet a TSO, but there's no requirement that a cigarette lighter socket be TSO'd. In fact, I doubt there's such a thing as a TSO'd cigarette lighter socket. All it has to do is meet the applicable FAA requirements. For a cigarette lighter socket, what would those requirements be? Basically, flammability and structural integrity, and pretty much any cigarette lighter socket's going to meet that. I think the cigarette lighter sockets that are mounted in factory aircraft are typically automotive cigarette lighters that were pressed into service. So no, there's no requirement for a TSO or a PMA. PMA, by the way, there's never a requirement to install a PMA part. PMA is a requirement for the person who is selling the product, but a mechanic or an owner can never get in trouble for installing a non-PMA part. The only person who could possibly get in trouble is the person who sold the part.
Good to know. Hey, Jake is wondering, I've used a previously approved 337 as approved data here in Arizona to install disc brakes on another aircraft. Is there any rule on copying previously approved work?
A field approval is an approval only for a particular installation on a particular aircraft. So just because something was field approved for somebody else doesn't mean that you can automatically install it on your own aircraft. However, if you can show the FSDO that the thing you want to do was previously field approved for somebody else, usually that will carry a lot of weight with the FSDO, and that will tend to streamline the field approval process. But you can't just use somebody else's field approval. You have to have your own field approval. But you can use somebody else's field approval to help expedite that process, if that makes sense.
Okay. John is asking, would replacing a damaged horizontal stabilizer with an identical undamaged part require anything other than a logbook entry?
No. First of all, it's not an alteration because you're not altering anything. And it's not a major repair because you're replacing the part, you're not repairing the part. If you were repairing that damaged horizontal stabilizer and the repair, for example, got involved in, say, splicing the spar of the horizontal stabilizer, that could be a major repair that would require FSDO approval. But if you simply replace the damaged stabilizer with a serviceable one, that's not a major repair. You're just replacing a part.
Okay, and that feeds into Richard's question. If I want to replace my engine with the same make and model, is this major or minor?
Well, it's not an alteration to begin with. Again, what we were basically talking about is making an alteration to the type design of the aircraft, and this is not what you were talking about is not an alteration, and it's basically a non-event as far as the FAA is concerned. Now, if you wanted to replace your engine with an engine of higher horsepower, that's an alteration, and it's a major alteration by the very definition of major alteration, because it's an alteration that's intended to change the performance of the aircraft. So it's clearly major, and it would require approved data of some sort, either an STC, or if lacking an STC, it would require field approval. But replacing the engine with the same kind of engine isn't an alteration at all, and doesn't require any approval from anybody.
And James is wondering how much of this, if any, applies to a SLSA, Special Light Sport Aircraft?
Well, the SLSAs are an interesting case. And I won't get too deep into this, but the regulations as they currently are written say that there are no such things as STCs for SLSAs, that no alteration can be made to an SLSA without the approval of the manufacturer. Now, I personally believe that regulation is illegal, and I have a letter that I wrote about 9 months ago to the Office of General Counsel of the FAA, challenging that, because I think that rule is not a legal rule. But that's until there is an interpretation by the FAA Office of General Counsel, that is the rule as written. So SLSAs, unlike normal certificated aircraft, cannot be altered in any way without the approval of the aircraft manufacturer.
Got it. We've had a couple.
It shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it is right now.
Yeah. We've had a couple people ask about experimental aircraft. Then is this applicable to experimental aircraft?
Experimental aircraft is the Wild West. You can do anything you want.
Okay, and Curtis is wondering, since installation of ADS-B out is considered minor, who can install the ADS-B unit? Does this require a mechanic to install and sign off, or can this be done by the owner?
If we're talking about a certificated aircraft, it has to be installed by an authorized person. It can't be installed by the owner because in installing equipment like that is not one of the 3 dozen things that are considered to be preventive maintenance that an owner is allowed to do on his own recognizance. It can be done by any mechanic. However, once it's installed, it has to go through the Mode S transponder component of it needs to go through the normal biennial certifications, and that has to be done by an avionics repair station. So a mechanic can install the unit, but assuming that that the installation involves a Mode S transponder, it would have to be certifications would have to be performed by an avionics repair station, and then of course would have to be performed every 24 months thereafter by an avionics repair station. If the ADS-B out were a UAT transmitter as opposed to a Mode S transponder, then there are no certification requirements for that, and so a mechanic can install it, and it would be a done deal.
Okay, Steve says a lot of Bonanza owners are getting rid of their vacuum pumps and going all electric. Is this a major or minor?
It's not a major alteration. In the instruments need to be TSO'd, but if you removed a vacuum-powered attitude indicator and directional gyro and installed electric gyros in their place, that's not a major alteration. That would not require any sort of FAA approval.
Okay. Gerald is wondering, can rosin visors be installed as a minor alteration?
Well, that's an interesting question. That's kind of a theoretical question, because rosin sun visors are STC'd, and so they come with approved data, and they normally are installed as a major alteration with a Form 337 file. But of course, no field approval is required because they're STC'd. There's a theoretical question, which is, what if you wanted to install a rosin sun visor and not file a Form 337? I contend that you could do that you could install the sun visor as a minor alteration, pretend it was an STC, throw away the STC paperwork, not claim that you were installing it pursuant to the STC, but using acceptable methods, techniques, and practices. In fact, I contend that an aircraft owner could install rosin sun visors because replacing and repairing interior furnishings is one of the items that is listed in Part 43 Appendix A as a preventive maintenance item that owners are allowed to do themselves. But practically speaking, since the rosin sun visor is STC'd and comes with STC paperwork, normally it's installed in a 337 file, and it's treated as a major alteration, but one that's already been approved.
Okay, Jack says, if I find an alteration with an STC for my aircraft and take it to my mechanic, what does he do specifically?
To install an STC'd alteration, let's take a specific example. Supposing you wanted to remove the rotating beacon and install a strobe. And so you buy a Wayland strobe light. It comes with STC paperwork. The mechanic installs it, fills out a Form 337, signs the block that is to be signed by the installing mechanic. Then there's a second block that needs to be installed, that needs to be signed by an IA. If the mechanic who installed it is an IA, he'll sign that block as well. If the mechanic who installed it is not an IA, he's going to have to find an IA to inspect the strobe installation and sign off the IA's block. And then the 337 with a copy of the STC simply gets sent to Oklahoma City. You never have to deal with the FSDO. You don't have to get approval for anything because it's already approved. But you do have to go through the paperwork, and it does require two signatures on the Form 337, one by the installing mechanic and one by the inspecting IA. And those both could be the same person, often are the same person.
Okay, Mike's wondering, is changing tire size on my aircraft a major alteration?
It is. If the specs for the airplane don't provide for the tire size that you want to install, then installing a different tire size is a major alteration.
Okay, Phil's wondering, could we install a USB charging port that is not TSO'd in a similar way as your cigarette lighter example?
In my opinion, you absolutely could, yes. Again, every mechanic is entitled to make that decision because he's the guy who's being asked to sign the logbook entry. But in my opinion, absolutely, you could install a USB port and hook it up to, you know, a circuit breaker on the circuit breaker panel using acceptable methods, techniques, and practices. The AC 4313 1B gives you all the information about what acceptable methods for hooking up electrical stuff is and what size wire you're supposed to use and all that kind of stuff. And if you follow acceptable methods, I think you absolutely can install a USB port, and it would be a minor alteration.
Gerald is asking, if I were to install an FAA PMA electronic voltage regulator that is not specifically approved for my airframe, but is approved for another aircraft type that has the exact same charging system, would it be reasonable to install it under a minor alteration?
I think probably not, because changing the regulator is a change to the basic design of the electrical system, in my judgment. But again, if this was approved for a substantially identical electrical system in a different make and model airplane, you probably would be able to get a field approval without too much difficulty. But I think you would have to go through that exercise.
Okay. Fred is wondering, strobe lights have been approved on several aircraft types, Cessna, but not my L-19. You think it'd be major or minor?
You're saying that the L-19 is not on the approved model list for the STC for the strobe light?
He just indicates strobe lights have been approved on several aircraft types, just not his L-19.
And again, that this is, each mechanic is entitled to his own judgment. In my judgment, all you would need to be able to demonstrate was that the strobe light met the certification requirements for anti-collision light in terms of, you know, color, brightness, coverage, the various things that are written into that particular regulation. And I think you could install it as a minor alteration. At least that would be my judgment if I were called upon to be the installing mechanic.
Okay, and Steve's wondering, can you install a 6-ply tire when the maintenance manual calls out a 4-ply tire?
You really aren't supposed to, no. Yeah, technically that's not airworthy. The manual specifies a particular size and ply rating. You're supposed to use that size and ply rating.
So then technically you'd need an STC to do a different ply rating or a field approval, it sounds like.
I think you probably would, yeah.
Okay, Paul's wondering, is there a list of instruments that need to be TSO'd?
Boy, that is a really good question. You know, I honestly do not know the answer to that. I don't think that there's an absolute requirement for instruments to be TSO'd. But if they aren't TSO'd and they're not original equipment, they probably need to have an STC or a field approval. A TSO is kind of like an STC, except that it applies to to any aircraft that it is installed in, not a particular list of models. And TSOs are normally issued for things that are so generic that they really don't care what kind of aircraft they're installed in. So things like altimeters or seat belts, that sort of thing, are typically TSO'd because an altimeter really doesn't care what kind of aircraft it's installed in. It just altimetes.
All right. Terry's wondering, back in the day, my IA mechanic removed an old VOR radio and installed a Loran in its place with a logbook entry only, noting CG and electrical load checks. Since I've had an IA that says that the installation required a 337 by the major minor definitions. It does seem like a minor installation. What's your opinion? By the way, the Loran has been since replaced with GPS with only a logbook entry.
I would hope so. I can't imagine what basis an IA could have for saying that was a major alteration. The only situation I can think of where it would be a major alteration is when you're installing an IFR certified GPS, because an IFR certified GPS requires a flight manual supplement, and that is considered to be a major alteration. But if you're installing a VFR GPS, certainly a Loran, because there wasn't really any such thing as an IFR certified Loran, I can't imagine any legitimate reason for saying that it's a major alteration.
Walt's wondering, does developing an STC for an alteration involve much more effort or paperwork than getting a field approval?
It does. It involves a lot more effort, and it's not something that you can do working with the local FSDO. You wind up having to work with the aircraft certification office, and the amount of rigmarole that you have to go through to get an STC is much, much greater.
Jack's wondering, is replacement of a door lock cylinder on a certificated aircraft a task an owner can perform under preventive maintenance?
There's nothing that explicitly suggests that it is. I mean, I wouldn't personally have any heartburn with it, but there is a specific list of 36 items that are considered to be preventive maintenance that an owner is allowed to do on his own recognizance, and changing a door lock cylinder is not one of them. So technically, I think that needs to be done by a mechanic. So if you do it, don't log it.
Let's see here. I didn't hear that. No, let's see here. Mark says...
I didn't say it. So how can you have heard it?
Exactly. They made a little static in the line. Mark says, I own a J model 310 with generators. The following year K model has alternators and is for all intents and purposes the same aircraft. So would that be a major alteration to the J model?
It would be, but it should be relatively easy to obtain a field approval if you can demonstrate to the FAA that what you're proposing to do is precisely what Cessna did. It should be relatively straightforward to get a field approval for it.
Okay, and John has a little story here. A friend had his aircraft in for a PA 28140 annual at a local FBO. The aircraft had years ago received repairs to the horizontal stab. The aircraft had previously been annualed several times by at least 2 other IAs. The FBO said the repairs were not proper and required the owner to obtain a serviceable part to replace the previously repaired stab. Was this a potential overreach by the FBO?
Well, I can't tell you that because, I mean, I don't know the facts of the case. It is quite possible that the repairs were improper and that you know, the first couple of IAs simply missed it. But if the owner was unhappy with the determination of that FBO, all he needed to do is tell the FBO that he was not prepared to replace the stabilizer and that he wanted the FBO to sign off his annual inspection with a discrepancy, and then go find the IA who signed off the previous annual and ask him to clear the discrepancy. You don't, just because an IA declares something unairworthy doesn't mean that you have to accept that. You can go find another IA who thinks it's okay. But again, I don't know the facts of the case. It may be that the FBO was right that the repair was improperly done. I obviously don't know the facts, so I can't.
Understand. Marvin is asking, what does IA stand for?
IA stands for inspection authorization. An A&P mechanic has to have an inspection authorization in order to do two things. It's required to sign off an annual inspection, and it's required to sign off the 337 form on a major repair or major alteration. Those are the three things that an IA is required for. To become an IA, you have to have been an A&P mechanic for a minimum of 3 years, and then you have to take an IA exam. And unlike a mechanic certificate, which is good indefinitely, the IA has to be renewed every 2 years.
Okay. We've had a couple people ask about experimentals, and I guess I just wanted to re-emphasize that the process you described tonight really doesn't apply to experimental amateur-built aircraft. The experimentals have in their operating limitations a requirement for if a major change is made to the aircraft once it receives its airworthiness certificate, then it must be returned to its phase 1 flight test period to prove that the major change is safe. And then once proven out, the owner makes a logbook entry certifying that the aircraft is safe through its normal range of operation as a result of that. And so the interesting thing about experimental amateur builts is major changes can be done by the owner operator or anyone the owner operator wants to do it that's qualified. There is no certificate requirement to do a major change or any maintenance for that matter with experimental aircraft. So just a clarification on that.
And as we said also, most of what we just talked about doesn't apply to SLSAs because SLSAs are not allowed to be altered except with the permission of the manufacturer of the SLSA.
Yes, yes. And however, the major change does come into play. People often call back here and ask, you know, I'm making this change, I'm making that change, I'm putting a different propeller on, different than the make and model I have now. Is that a major change? And that speaks directly then, how do you figure that out, to what you said at the very beginning of your presentation about the definition. So that is the same and very applicable.
Yeah, and even though Part 43 doesn't apply to experimentals, the list of major alterations in Part 43 Appendix A is probably applicable in helping to make the decision whether an alteration is major or not for the purposes you're talking about here.
Yes, yes. And the interesting thing is there's no paperwork required when you do make your major change on your experimental. If you do make a major change, you don't have to complete a 337 and submit it to the FAA. Actually, I should say, you don't do it. It's not that you don't have to. You don't do it. It's not a requirement.
But you do have to go back to phase 1 flight text.
Yeah, go back to phase 1, flight test it for as long as your operating limitations require, and then sign off in the log. Then once you've completed that it's safe. Chris is wondering, is there a threshold for weight and balance consideration of an alteration?
Yes, well, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. But what the definition says is that changing the empty weight or the empty center of gravity of an aircraft does not make it a major alteration, but an alteration that changes the maximum certificated gross weight or the fore or aft limits of the envelope is a major alteration. So if you're changing the limits, that's a major alteration. If you're just changing the empty weight or MTCG, that's not a major alteration.
Walt's wondering, can an existing STC installation be altered to improve it through a field approval?
I don't see any reason why not.
Interesting. Oh, geez, let's see here. Looks like we're gotten just about to the end of the questions. We have a number of repeating questions here. Let's just go with this one John has. It's a little different. Does installing a battery-powered temporary in-cockpit nightlight in one of the cigarette ashtray require any kind of logbook entry or other documentation?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but if the thing is physically attached to the aircraft with a fastener, then it at least requires a logbook entry. If it's just something you plugged into a cigarette lighter that was not effectively installed in the aircraft, then it doesn't require a logbook entry. Then it's considered to just be portable equipment.
Now, you mentioned something earlier about Velcroing on GoPro cameras. How does that play in?
Well, I'm not an expert on that, but I know that there have been some rulings by the FAA that allow people to do what a lot of people have been doing, which is to attach cameras to the outside of the aircraft without making a big deal out of it. And I don't offhand know what the specific guidance is, but I know the FAA has said something about that, and it's fairly liberal.
It must have something to do with if it's physically attached to the aircraft through some sort of fastener, eh?
Yeah, I think there's some guidance from the FAA on that subject, but I can't lay my hands on it right now. So,
okay. Gordon is wondering, does this also apply to large or turbine-powered aircraft? Part 91, subpart F.
Well, the basic principle of major alterations and minor alterations certainly applies to any certificated aircraft. There are certainly things that are major alterations for say pressurized aircraft that would be a minor alteration for an unpressurized aircraft. For example, installing an antenna that penetrates the pressure vessel is considered to be a major alteration, and not only that, but requires a designated engineering representative to sign off on it. If you were installing that same antenna on an unpressurized airplane, it would be a minor alteration, would require anything in particular.
Mark's wondering, does a clamp-on type yoke mount for an iPad require a logbook entry?
No, it's clamp-on. If it was riveted on, it would, though.
And James is wondering, Mike, I want to remove the back seat in our 1961 172 in order to place some luggage in the back where the seat was. As owner-operator, can I make this as a minor or major alteration, or can it be done legally by me?
Interesting. The way that works is the following. Removal and reinstallation of seats is explicitly listed as one of the operations that an owner is allowed to do on his own recognizance as preventive maintenance. However, the thing that an owner is not allowed to do on his own is to recalculate the weight and balance data for the aircraft. So if you want to be strictly legal about this, what you should do is get an A&P to work you up two sets of weight and balance numbers for your aircraft, one with the seat installed and one with it removed. And once you have those two weight and balance documents, then you can remove and reinstall the seats yourself as an owner. You should make a logbook entry because it's considered to be preventive maintenance, but you don't need to get a mechanic involved.
And Chris is wondering, does installing something like a USB port or cigarette lighter socket require a change to the weight and balance?
Typically, the change is negligible. There's an official FAA definition of a negligible change of weight and balance, and I can't quote it exactly. For light aircraft, I think it negligible normally means a change in weight of less than a pound and a change of center of gravity of less than 1/10 of an inch. And for heavier aircraft, it's a little bit larger than that. But if you look in the FAA weight and balance handbook, which is an advisory circular on the number I can't quote from memory, it does give you a formal definition of what a negligible change to weight and balance is. And normally putting in something like a cigarette lighter socket or a USB port or something is a negligible change so that you don't really need to do anything about it.
Cool. Michael is asking, I have an SLSA Jabiru and want to put in an ADSB out transponder to replace the existing one. In a normal airplane, that would be a minor change. Does it still require approval by the manufacturer?
My understanding is that it does. Again, I don't think it should be that way. I honestly don't think that aspect of the SLSA rule, what is it, 91.327 or whatever it is legal. And I've written a letter to the FAA Office of General Counsel challenging its legality. I haven't gotten a response yet. But as the rule is written, alterations to SLSAs have to be approved by the manufacturer, and I'm almost certain that would include replacing the transponder.
All right. Last question here, a little off topic, but let's take it anyways. Terry's wondering, why can an A&P sign off a 100-hour inspection, but not an annual inspection, since both inspections are performed to the exact same checklist per Part 43?
It's a good question. And you're absolutely right. The scope and detail of a 100-hour inspection, annual inspection are identical. The only difference between them is who is allowed to sign it off. And I honestly don't know what the history is behind that, but that's the rule.
All right, Mike. Well, hey, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. Please take a moment and share your closing comments.
Okay, well, just kind of the usual stuff. Anybody who isn't already on my mailing list, I would encourage you to sign up for my monthly newsletter that we send out every month with all sorts of interesting maintenance-related stuff in it. Lately, we've been sending out a lot of information on the Continental camshaft gear issues and so on. And you can either sign up for the newsletter by going to the website at savvyaviation.com, or at the end of the webinar, Tim will be putting up a survey, and on that survey, it will include a checkbox that you can check if you want to be added to the mailing list. My book manifesto is available at Amazon. I'm working on my second book right now on engines, which I'm hoping to complete by about the end of the year. I'm hoping it will be available at Convention 2018. And if you'd like to find out more about my engine book, you can go to my Patreon site. That's the URL. And finally, the next couple of webinars coming up in July, we're going to be doing a webinar on board scopes. And in August, I'm going to be doing a webinar on the Rotax 912 engine. Talk about how it differs from traditional Continentals and Lycomings. And that one is going to be the second Wednesday of August rather than the first Wednesday of August because of AirVenture. And Tim, that's all I've got.
All right, Mike. Hey, thank you so much. And to everybody who tuned in tonight, I saw on my counter probably about 375, maybe a little bit more. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your night to tune in. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.